The rock and roll years, from the early 1960s through to the late 80s, we lived through an explosion of pop culture such as the world has never seen. And it wasn't just America and Europe, it was everywhere. Kids in the rest of the world had their own movies, pop music, and fashion. This series tells their story. Today, movies.
In some parts of the West, we tend to think of foreign films as highbrow art house movies. But from Moscow to Mexico, what people really watched during the rock and roll years wasn't all that far from what we were getting out of Hollywood. All over the world, pop cinema was soap operas, action, romance, and fantasy. The difference was what happened when these familiar movies were made for local audiences. Our story opens in 1965. America was moving into Vietnam. The Beatles, the Stones, and the Supremes were on top of the charts. Blockbuster pictures like The Sound of Music and Thunderball were doing big business. But in Mexico, the greatest action hero of Latin cinema was at the peak of his career.
El Santo died in 1984 and was buried in his mask.
Action heroes are a part of every culture. When I started out as a singer, I'd sing the Goldfinger song and everybody knew the words. There was even an Eastern European alternative to James Bond, Agent J-23. Every country has to have its own action hero. When I was a teenager in the 60s, James Bond was huge. Goldfinger, Dr. No. But in some countries, big American movies were politically unacceptable. So they made their own movies to take the place of Hollywood. It's time to look at the giant of world cinema. Although it might seem so, Hollywood wasn't the biggest movie machine in the world during the rock and roll years. Bollywood was. It's called Bollywood because it grew up in Bombay, India. Bombay is called Mumbai now, but it's still the heart of the Hindi language film industry. Across the world, the movies were about to spark an enormous craze. It was called Kung Fu, and there was a lot more to it than Bruce Lee. I used to sing a song called Kung Fu Girls. I had some 9-foot-high cartoon monsters I kicked through like Bruce Lee. It was my little contribution to the enormous martial arts craze of the 1970s. Like so many fads, it had a backstory we knew nothing about. The best Kung Fu films, like the ones Cheng Pei starred in, were made with high production values. But during the Kung Fu explosion of the 1970s, Hong Kong started to crank them out like sausages. Cheap films fed the appetite of foreign fans in other parts of Asia and here in the West. It would take years for Kung Fu to recover.
There was plenty of nudity, drunkenness, and sudden violence.
This fad for realism was short-lived. Life was tough and people wanted a break. So it's not surprising that East Europe was ripe for some romance on TV, but nobody knew just how big a show could get. In the late 70s and early 80s, Brazil began moving back to democracy. Censorship was dropped, and in 1976 and 77, a Brazilian soap opera was made that would be bigger than any other TV show in history. It was a big hit in Brazil,